This is AI Command App Media Lens. Every day, the same stories get told differently, depending on who's telling them. Today, we're looking at 5 stories that dominated the cycle and what changes when you read them side by side. Story 1. A Dutch-flagged expedition cruise ship, the MV Hondius, docked in Tenerife in Spain's Canary Islands this weekend after a hantavirus outbreak on board. Passengers are being evacuated. 17 Americans are being repatriated to a quarantine center in Nebraska. Same docking event, watch what each outlet leads with. PBS NewsHour led with logistics. Evacuations begin. Passengers taken to a military hospital in Madrid. The Guardian US led with the Americans angle. 17 US passengers being moved to a Nebraska quarantine center. The BBC kept it close to home for British viewers, with a reporter on the dock in Tenerife, plus a separate story about British paratroopers dropping onto Tristan da Cunha, a remote British territory, to help a suspected case. The New York Times ran that paratrooper story too, but framed it around the archipelago and the military operation. ABC News led with a watch this video clip of passengers in protective suits walking to shore, and The Hill led with a political quote, the acting CDC director saying, "This is not COVID." The same docking becomes a logistics story, a citizen repatriation story, a military operation, a visual TV moment, or a public health reassurance, depending on whether the outlet thinks you care about process, citizens, soldiers, pictures, or policy. Story 2. Iran responded to a U.S. ceasefire proposal this weekend through Pakistani mediators. While that response was being delivered, a cargo ship caught fire off Qatar's coast. The UAE and Kuwait both reported drone strikes. The ceasefire is, at best, fragile. Here's how 7 different outlets framed the same day. PBS NewsHour led with diplomacy. Iran responds to ceasefire proposal. NPR led with the incident. Cargo ship catches fire after being hit. The BBC chose the warning frame. Iran warns against complying with U.S. sanctions. ABC News and The Hill both led with a U.S. official. Ambassador Mike Waltz saying it's up to President Trump to call the ceasefire violation. The Guardian US led with economics. Supply chain analysts warning of a degree of complacency about jet fuel shortages and energy shock. The Wall Street Journal led with corporate impact. Saudi Aramco profit jumps despite war disrupting shipping routes. And the New York Times led with the human cost inside Iran. Mass layoffs in Iran as businesses buckle under wartime pressures. Same conflict. A PBS reader sees diplomatic process. An NPR reader sees a fire on a ship. A Guardian reader sees a coming energy shock. A Journal reader sees rising oil profits. A Times reader sees Iranians losing their jobs. None of those is wrong. Each one points your attention somewhere different. Story 3. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour Party took heavy losses in UK local elections last week. Calls for his resignation are mounting. He has refused to step down. ABC News ran the most dramatic framing. Starmer fights for his job as calls for his ouster grow. The verbs are physical and urgent. The New York Times kept it cool and structural. Keir Starmer says no, he won't resign, with a subhead asking how a leadership challenge would actually unfold. NPR went explainer mode. Here's what comes next. ABC frames politics as a fight. The Times frames it as a process. NPR frames it as a question to be answered. None of those headlines is false. They each prime you differently, for drama, for analysis, or for orientation. Story 4. After a Supreme Court ruling that weakened the Voting Rights Act, multiple southern red states are moving to redraw their congressional maps. Separately, a Virginia court tossed out a state map, throwing Democratic House races into chaos. The Hill ran 2 parallel framings on the same day. One quoted Representative Jim Clyburn calling Chief Justice John Roberts one of the infamous justices over the ruling. A separate Hill piece walked state by state through which red states are advancing new maps, procedural on one side, partisan on the other. The New York Times leaned into the Democratic side. Democrats searched desperately for a response, with words like fury and scramble in the lead. ABC News stayed neutral. Nationwide battle over redistricting escalates. And The Guardian ran an opinion piece by Jamil Smith calling gerrymandering the most effective weapon in U.S. politics and demanding a new Voting Rights Act. Same court ruling, same maps. The Hill gives you a partisan quote and a procedural list. The Times centers democratic emotion. ABC keeps the verbs neutral. The Guardian tells you what to think. Watch the verbs, scramble, search desperately, escalates, outlaw. Each one paints a different picture of who is acting and who is being acted on. Story 5. President Trump is heading to Beijing this week for a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's a high-stakes visit happening against the backdrop of the Iran conflict and disrupted global shipping. The Hill ran both sides of the partisan aisle in the same news cycle. Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on armed services, called Trump terribly weakened going into the meeting. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich called the same meeting a possible remarkable breakthrough. Same trip. Two opposite framings. The Hill ran them within hours of each other. The Guardian published a Simon Tisdall opinion piece arguing CI holds all the cards, with the phrase out-of-control wrecking ball applied to Trump. The New York Times ran an analysis piece titled An Emboldened New China Spells Trouble for Trump, analytical in tone, but committing to a clear thesis. China no longer fears U.S. strength. The Hill's choice to publish both Reed and Gingrich on the same story is, itself, an editorial choice. It says, here are the two sides. The Guardian and the Times each picked a thesis and ran with it. You can see how outlet structure, whether to balance, whether to commit to a take, shapes the picture before a single fact gets reported. That's today's Media Lens from AI Command app. For 5 stories, same facts, different lenses. The point isn't that any one outlet got it wrong. It's that every editorial choice, word choice, whose quote leads, whether to balance or commit, shapes what you think the story is about. The more lenses you compare, the more you see. Same stories, different lenses. See you tomorrow.